It's 13 hours GMT. I'm Jackie Leonard. This is the newsroom from the BBC World Service. The head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has admitted that the EU isn't where it wants to be with its immunisation programme.
We were late with the approval. We were too optimistic on mass production, and perhaps we were also too certain that the orders would actually be delivered on time.
A World Health Organization expert has criticised US intelligence on the origins of the pandemic. Tens of thousands of people in Myanmar have protested for a fifth day against the military coup.
The younger generation, they are now rejecting the military coup. So I believe our people power, the power of the powerless.
We look ahead to what the second day of Mr. Trump's impeachment trial might bring. Also in the programme.
And I think everybody who's seen the video can understand my consternation.
We'll hear from the star of the latest viral Zoom mishap video. All here on the newsroom from the BBC World Service in London. We'll begin with the bulletin.
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. The European Commission President has admitted that the EU is not where it wants to be on immunising people against the coronavirus. Ursula von der Leyen has been criticised for her handling of the process. Kevin Connolly reports.
The EU's vaccination programme has become an important political test for the European Commission, which took over responsibility for the rollout from individual member states and has so far lagged behind the UK, the United States and Israel, among others. It's also become a critical test of the personal standing of Ursula von der Leyen. She has now acknowledged failings and admitted underestimating the difficulties of mass vaccine production. But this was not by any means a straightforward admission of failure. Ms von der Leyen said it was right for the EU to have acted together rather than competing as individual nation states.
A World Health Organization expert looking into the coronavirus has criticised US intelligence on the origins of the disease. Here's Michael Bristow.
Peter Daszak was part of a WHO team that's just completed an investigation in the Chinese city of Wuhan into the source of the virus. These experts concluded that the pandemic had not started with a leak from a Chinese laboratory, as some have claimed. Responding to that finding, a US official questioned whether China had fully cooperated with the WHO team in Wuhan. Mr. Daszak hit back, saying US intelligence had been frankly wrong on many occasions. The row suggests the WHO might have difficulty persuading the world that its investigation in China turned up everything there was to find.
Pakistan's Supreme Court has commuted the death sentences of two mentally ill prisoners who've been awaiting execution for years, ruling that they should be sent to mental health institutions. It also directed that a mercy plea be filed on behalf of a third prisoner with mental illness who is also facing the death penalty. All three were convicted of murder. Jill McGivering reports.
All three prisoners were convicted of murder and already served years in jail. All three have been diagnosed with mental ill health. Kanizan Bibi was a teenage maid when she was convicted of killing 6 people, and she's been on death row for more than 30 years. Her lawyers say she can't speak or feed herself. She and another prisoner will now be transferred to a health facility. Rights groups who've long fought for mental illness to be taken into consideration in such cases hail the judgment as historic.
A court in Moscow has issued an arrest warrant for the opposition activist Alexei Navalny's chief of staff, Leonid Volkov. It applies in the Commonwealth of Independent States, the bloc of 9 former Soviet countries. State media said he was charged with inciting children to take part in unlawful acts that might endanger their lives, meaning protests in support of Mr. Navalny. News from the BBC. US Democrats will formally begin making their case today for the impeachment of Donald Trump. They'll argue that the former president is guilty of insurrection for inciting his supporters to besiege the US Capitol building on January the 6th. The Democrats will have to persuade 17 Republican senators to switch sides. Saudi Arabia says the airport serving the southern city of Abha has been hit in an attack launched by Houthi rebels based in neighbouring Yemen. According to the Saudi authorities, the strike caused a fire in a civilian aircraft. The Houthis frequently send missiles and drones across the border, but they're usually destroyed by the kingdom's air defences. The Ugandan government says it's fully restored internet and social media services, which were switched off since the eve of last month's elections for what it said were security reasons. During the election campaign, Facebook took the controversial step of closing down government-linked accounts, which it said were being used to manipulate public debate or spread false information. Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel is expected to push for tough coronavirus restrictions to be extended until at least next month, when she meets regional leaders today. Jenny Hill reports.
Germany's lockdown, imposed at the end of last year, appears to be working. Infections are falling, prompting fierce political debate over how and when to reopen society. But Angela Merkel, like many scientists, is worried about the spread of new mutations. She's expected to urge regional leaders to extend the closure of schools, shops, restaurants and arts and leisure facilities until at least the beginning of next month. She'll encounter significant resistance, not least from those who want to reopen schools as soon as possible.
More than 170 people are still missing after a glacial torrent swept down a mountainside in northern India on Sunday. Emergency teams have been struggling to clear a tunnel filled with icy water. BBC News.
Hello, I'm Jackie Leonard, and you're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. Countries around the world face a huge task in vaccinating their populations against coronavirus. But the European Union has got off to a relatively slow start. And today, the European Commission President has admitted that the EU's vaccination programme is not where she wants it to be. In comments to the European Parliament, Ursula von der Leyen defended the Commission's overall strategy, but she acknowledged failings in the procurement of vaccines on behalf of all EU countries.
Wir waren spät dran bei der Zulassung.
We were late with the approval. We were too optimistic on mass production, and perhaps we were also too certain that the orders would actually be delivered on time. We have to ask ourselves why this happened and what we can learn from it.
So how significant was Mrs. von der Leyen's admission?
There's a general recognition across the EU that the vaccines issue is now a major test of the competence of the European Commission. That's the body run by Ursula von der Leyen that took the responsibility of a vaccine policy away from individual member states, concentrated it in the hands of the officials in Brussels, and it's now acknowledged to be rather slow in rolling out a vaccine policy compared, for example, to the United Kingdom or Israel or the United States. So Ursula von der Leyen said today there's still a hope of vaccinating 70% of the EU population by the end of the summer. As she said, we were maybe too optimistic when it came to massive production. We're not where we want to be, but she still defended the idea of the EU doing this collectively rather than as a group of individual member states. And she also continued to defend the relatively slow authorization of vaccines, saying that there was a good reason to be cautious in that kind of authorization. So there was a hint of a mea culpa about the speech, but still also a strong defense of the Commission's way of doing business.
And is the hint of a mea culpa enough for the people who are more critical of the way that the whole of the European Commission has handled this?
I don't think it will be. I mean, I think there's very strong support for the concept of unified European action within the EU. You're not going to hear the French government criticising the European Commission very directly on this kind of matter. But what you will see, I think, and perhaps see more of this in the weeks and months to come, is that Hungary, for example, has been exploring the use of Russian and Chinese vaccines and is taking action as an individual member state. The German government is making a larger budget available and is talking about buying vaccines itself, which would not just be for the German people, but for some other Europeans as well. So there may be a political reluctance to criticise the European Commission very directly, but in parallel with that reluctance, you might also see individual European governments trying to fix gaps in the vaccine policy, because whatever politicians say, ordinary Europeans are very aware that the EU is behind the UK, the US and Israel, among other nations, in getting the vaccine rolled out.
That was Kevin Connolly. Well, South Africa is having even bigger problems than the EU. It decided to temporarily scrap plans to use the AstraZeneca vaccine, which it already had, after a small trial found it was less effective against a local variant of the virus. So what next? Well, the Health Ministry has now said it will give the Johnson & Johnson jab to frontline health workers, even though it hasn't been approved yet. The details came from the Health Minister, Zweli Mkhize.
Given the outcomes of the efficacy studies, the Department of Health will continue its planned phase 1 vaccination, targeting the health workers using the Johnson & Johnson vaccine instead of the AstraZeneca vaccine. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine has been proven effective against the 501YV2 variant, and the necessary approval processes for use in South Africa are underway. In addition, the country has also secured the doses from Pfizer for phase 1 rollout.
Well, let's cross over to Johannesburg now and speak to our correspondent there, Pumza Filani. Now, Pumza, the Johnson & Johnson one hasn't actually been approved yet, so why have they decided to prioritise this vaccine?
So one of the main reasons they've chosen this, Jackie, comes from the results of a study that was done with about 40,000 volunteers in South Africa and in South America and in the US, which found that it is effective in responding to various mutations. So they believe that it is the most suited in dealing with the new variant here in South Africa. And that's important because about 90% of the infections that we're seeing in this country are currently from the new variant. So officials are trying to find ways of speeding up the approval process. They've approached a local regulatory body here known as SAPRA and are saying to them, look, we understand it's going to take 3 months to get this properly approved, but we can then do it as an implementation study, and that approval takes a matter of days. So they're hoping that SAPRA will agree to let them use it as part of a study. If they do, it means 500,000 health workers could, as early as next week, get on the Johnson & Johnson jab, and whatever results they get from that, they're hoping will then give information on how to roll it out nationwide.
Now, meanwhile, South Africa has hundreds of thousands of doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine. What's it going to do with them?
Yes, and one of the things that South Africans are asking, because quite a lot of money was spent acquiring those vaccines, is they want to know it's not going to go to waste. The Health Ministry says they are in contact with various African countries who've expressed interest in buying it from South Africans and swapping it out, but also they've spoken to the suppliers to see how many of the jabs they can return and try and get access to something that's of equal value. As it stands, that's sort of what's happening behind the scenes. It is something that South Africans are keenly watching, because there have been a myriad of reports of wasteful expenditure around how the COVID pandemic has been dealt with here.
Pumza, thank you. That was Pumza Filani speaking to us from Johannesburg. This is the BBC World Service in London. Still to come on the newsroom, the prisoner who isn't being released even though his jail sentence is over. First, Jerry has the headlines.
The head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has admitted that the EU was too late ordering coronavirus vaccines and is not where it wants to be with its immunisation programme. A World Health Organization expert has criticised US intelligence on the origins of the pandemic. And the Supreme Court in Pakistan has commuted the death sentences of 2 mentally ill prisoners who spent many years awaiting execution.
For the 5th day in a row, mass protests have been held in cities and towns across Myanmar. In the main city, Yangon, an estimated 100,000 people, including civil servants, students and doctors, gathered to demonstrate against the military coup, which removed the civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi. Nguyen Chan A of the BBC Burmese service sent this report from Yangon a little before we came on air.
Protests are large, but remain mostly peaceful, not just in Yangon, but also in other major cities across the nation today. Here in Yangon, I've particularly seen more workers from private sectors who come up onto the streets in solidarity with government staff for the cause of civil disobedience movement. They are chanting anti-military slogans as well as calling out all civil servants to stop working and come out. They have also demonstrated in front of the US Embassy and the Chinese Embassy and the United Nations office in Yangon, demanding to support democracy and release of the detained leaders.
San is a student activist. He says the police know who he is and are looking for him, but he's on the run.
I should contribute even my life to oppose this military coup and dictatorship. We protest every day since the 3rd February. We, all of the people in Myanmar, hate the military dictatorship, especially our younger generation. So the younger generation, they are now rejecting the military coup. So I believe our people power, the power of the powerless.
The BBC Southeast Asia correspondent Jonathan Head is keeping a close eye on events in Myanmar from neighbouring Thailand.
Yangon itself is really more of a festival. It is a defiance of military authority. The military, remember, its stronghold is in Naypyidaw. It's probably much more worried about what happens there. We've got civil servants on strike out on the streets today, but we haven't yet seen the sort of very strong, angry rallies we saw yesterday confronting the police. In Yangon, we've had bare-chested bodybuilders. We've had young women coming in multicoloured floor-length ball gowns. Uniforms galore. There are doctors in their hospital gowns, engineers, teachers again with their white tops. It's very colourful. It's very festive. The whole population comes out, holds up pictures of Aung San Suu Kyi. I have a sense that for the moment, maybe the authorities will just let this run, but they will need at some point to decide how they bring it under control, because it's a clear defiance of the coup. It's a defiance of the warning that laws will be enforced now that there should be no gatherings more than 5 people. And yet, I suspect at the top they realise that at least they would prefer not to go back to the way in which these sorts of uprisings were dealt with in the past, which involved a lot of bloodshed, huge international condemnation, and then isolation from Myanmar. It isn't clear that the authorities who seize power have a game plan for this. We're not sure whether or not just kind of figuring it out day to day. Don't forget the game plan that was announced at the beginning of this coup, that they will hold another election. They will remake the election commission, which was refusing to acknowledge the military's complaints about irregularities, and almost certainly, because there'd be no point in the coup otherwise, they will find a way, using probably criminal charges, to invalidate Aung San Suu Kyi's chances of running again. That plan, I'm sure, is still in place, but it will provoke even more anger when they do it. Right now, what they've got is a whole country determined to show they do not accept this coup.
That was Jonathan Head. A court in Australia has ruled that a man who was jailed for leading a terrorist group can still be detained despite completing a 15-year sentence. Abdul Nasser Benbrika was due to be released in November, but can now be detained for another 3 years. Our correspondent in Sydney, Shaima Khalil, told us more about him.
Well, Abdul Nasser Benbrika is a well-known Muslim cleric, and he was sentenced originally for intentionally being a member of a terrorist group and directing its activities. He was a well-known supporter of Osama bin Laden, and he was described as the guiding light for the group that he headed. And this group allegedly discussed plotting high-profile attacks, attacking famous places around Australia. He has been in prison since 2005, and he was sentenced to 15 years in jail.
Now, he has served his term, so why do they want to keep him locked up, and how can they?
Well, this is a very rarely used provision in the law, and it can keep an offender in custody for up to 3 years beyond his sentence, and it can be extended. It's called a continuing detention order. That's what the government had applied for. That's what the Home Affairs Minister, Peter Dutton, had applied for to firstly the Victorian Supreme Court, and then it went to the High Court. And in his argument, Mr. Dutton said that this was an appropriate action to take because Benbrika still posed a danger to the Australian people, and he was quoted as saying, well, this is a man who spoke about thousands and thousands of Australians being killed, and that's what he advocated for. The case went from Victoria's Supreme Court to the High Court, and they found that the law was valid, that the government's application was valid, and they said that it was appropriately tailored to protect the community from the singular threat of terrorist criminal activity, where there was no other measure to prevent the risk.
And what sort of response is there to this decision? Do any of the civil liberties bodies and campaigners in Australia have concerns about the use of continuing detention orders?
I mean, it is a cause for concern. I mean, we heard, of course, from his lawyers, for example, from Benbrika's lawyers, because they argued about the validity of the law. They said that the extension was unfair, that he had served his sentence, and that the government didn't really have the power to impose the law. But essentially what they argued was that Benbrika was being punished for what he might do, not what he has done, which is the main concern.
That was Shaima Khalil. The impeachment trial of Donald Trump will resume in a few hours after US senators voted on Tuesday to press ahead with it. Democrats will present their opening arguments in their effort to prove that the former president incited insurrection when Congress was stormed by a mob in January. Mr. Trump has declined to give evidence and watched Tuesday's proceedings on television from his estate in Florida. Barbara Pletasher sent this report from Washington.
On this vote, the ayes are 56. The nays are 44.
The first order of business was to decide whether the trial should even go ahead. Donald Trump's lawyers argued it was unconstitutional because he's no longer president. But the Senate voted to proceed. And Democrats previewed the case they plan to make. A visual and visceral account of the Capitol riot, linking the president's fiery words with disturbing scenes of violence.
Senators, this cannot be our future. This cannot be the future of America. We cannot have presidents inciting and mobilizing mob violence against our government and our institutions because they refuse to accept the will of the people under the Constitution of the United States.
Representative so-and-so seeks to walk back comments about, I forget what it was, something that bothered her.
Mr. Trump's lawyers got off to a rambling and rocky start. Sources said he didn't sound pleased with their performance.
They want to put you through a 16-hour presentation over 2 days, focusing on as if it were some sort of blood sport. And to what end? For healing? For unity? For accountability? Not for any of those. For surely there are much better ways to achieve each. It is again for pure, raw, misguided partisanship.
The partisan division in the Senate held. Most Republicans voted against proceeding with the trial. They're wary of crossing Donald Trump. But Democrats are determined to make them face in graphic detail the actions of Mr. Trump and his supporters.
Barbara Pletasher. One of the world's biggest brewers, Heineken, has announced plans to cut almost 10% of its workforce in response to a sharp drop in sales because of the pandemic. It said 8,000 jobs would go. This report from Anna Holligan in The Hague.
With bars and restaurants across the globe closed, it's perhaps inevitable the brewers are taking a financial hit. Beer sales fell by 8% as hospitality venues were hammered by lockdown restrictions. Heineken said the restructuring of its head office, regional offices and local operations will result in a one-off cost of around €420 million. With more people drinking at home, retail volumes remain strong, with the Heineken brand drinks experiencing a double-digit growth in the UK.
Anna Holligan. Here in Britain, within the past hour, the government has announced an extra £3.5 billion, that's almost $5 billion, to help pay for the removal of flammable cladding from high-rise residential buildings in England. The government set up a fund worth more than $2 billion last year in response to the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017, which killed more than 70 people. Cladding was blamed for the disaster, and leaseholders in similar flats are paying huge bills for fire safety measures. Speaking in Parliament, the Housing Secretary, Robert Jenrick, announced a new levy on future developments and said there would also be help for leaseholders of flats in low and medium-rise blocks where the fire risk is reduced.
The government will develop a long-term scheme to protect leaseholders in this situation with financial support for cladding remediation on buildings between 4 and 6 stories. Under a long-term low-interest scheme, no leaseholder will ever pay more than £50 a month towards the removal of unsafe cladding, many far less.
New Zealand is urging Micronesian countries not to leave the Pacific's most influential regional body. The Pacific Islands Forum is facing a crisis after nearly a third of its members quit on Monday in protest at the organisation's choice of Secretary-General. Phil Mercer reports from Sydney.
Peace and harmony are among the official goals of the Pacific Islands Forum. But there is division within one of the world's most geographically diverse regional bodies. Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, said the decision by Micronesian nations to leave the forum was regrettable. Experts believe that Palau, the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, Kiribati and Nauru feel overlooked by larger Melanesian members, including Papua New Guinea and Fiji, who are culturally different.